The Makers of Magic, The Four Winds, A.M. Byrne, Chapter 1, Problems. William had now been at Lakefield School for 9 months, his third school in as many years. He hated the constant changing and always being new, and knew without a doubt that it was because the teachers and head teachers saw him as difficult to teach and a disruption in the classroom and wanted him gone. But he loved learning. He just struggled with all the reading, writing, and maths, none of which ever made sense to him. He struggled to keep all the words, letters, and numbers still on the page. They seemed to have a life of their own, sliding and spinning around on the ice rink white paper. Sitting down still, every lesson was also a problem. He wanted to move, run, and build stuff with his hands that he had designed, reviewed, tested, and built in his head. He had no choice, though, but to sit still on an uncomfortable plastic chair, knees tucked under the imprisoning table, while he battled the fizzing energy building inside him that would eventually explode like a bottle rocket launching off at the sound of the end of lesson school bell. On one particular occasion, his Latin teacher, who was a dragon of a lady, had called him to the front. "William Taylor," he looked up from the rocket ship he was drawing in his notebook. "Yes, miss," he replied with apprehension. "Ah, good. Paying attention for once. Please come to the front and read the first section of Chapter 3 if you have remembered your textbook." William's brain panicked. "Not me," he thought, while his heart started to beat rapidly with dread. He hated reading, and even more so in front of the class, during a pointless lesson. Who spoke Latin anymore? It was, as the teacher put it, a dead language. Now there were old ancient Latin-type things William did find interesting, such as catapults and castles, but the teacher did not care or know anything about them. It was all numbers, letters and words, boring gibberish to him. Despite his feelings of dread and panic, he had been asked to do it, so he did. Taking a deep breath, he pushed his chair back slowly, screeching the legs across the floor as if the chair was protesting to being moved and sounding just how William felt. He hated having to do this, but he had a plan to get it over and done with. He would read with lots of long and slow ums and ers and joke around asking the class to fill in words he could not read. At the same time, he would laugh to make it all a joke. William knew that if he could get the class to laugh at him, the teacher would have to step in to regain control and would then ask William to stop and sit down. Yes, it was a bit of a humiliation to William, but it was worth it, and it worked perfectly. It worked every time. This was the normal story for William, because school was not for William, and William was not for school. In most lessons, he would daydream and invent machines, gadgets, and create stories in his head. Sometimes he would imagine machines that would stop the teacher from talking, tie them up in their chair, and then catapult them out of the classroom window. Other times, when he just could not cope any longer, he would end up in the sick bay with a headache, waiting for his parents to come and pick him up. He always hoped for his dad, as he was always more understanding than his mum, who just said he was not trying hard enough. There was one lesson that William really loved, though, and that was design and technology. Here, he was top of the class, a natural in that environment. For William, this class was like a duck taking to water. It all just meshed and made sense. He understood everything that was being taught. He could even do the maths involved to solve a problem. And for once, he was the one being approached by others in the class asking for his help. The teacher would even ask him to go and help others with their work when he'd finished early, yet again. William loved that he was not forced to sit at a tiny prison cell of a desk for an hour or two, to stare at a textbook with moving words he didn't understand. In the workshop, everything was alive, making fantastic noises and smells that talked to him about what was going on, and he knew how everything worked. He loved the feel of the machines through his hands as they rumbled away, allowing the cold, dimpled texture of the metal surface to come alive under his hand. He could tell, just from listening to the rhythmical screech, screech, screech sound a lathe was making in the metal workshop next door, that the metal stock the machine was cutting was not quite round yet, and the object was only at the very beginning of revealing what it was going to be. He loved the smell of all the glues and paints, even though they probably were not good for him. They were sweet-smelling and thick in the air, making him feel happy. Lastly, there was the woodwork shop, a magical place of hardwood-handled tools that had not changed their design for hundreds of years, and beautiful wood shavings all curled up on the floor. This was William's type of lesson, and he was good at it. In fact, he was better than good. He was the best. He knew what to do and how to do it, and he had a teacher who he thought was brilliant and not out to get him like all the other classroom-based teachers. His teacher was called Mr. G. Stevenson. William called him Mr. Stevenson, or Sir for short. He was a very relaxed and friendly teacher, although his build and posture spoke of military service. Rarely having to shout at his class to get their attention, he would tell interesting and exciting stories about how the item they were making had been used in history, always leaving the class transfixed, even if it was just about a clock. William had always felt that Mr. Stevenson trusted him. It would be William who he would put in charge of tools and machinery when he had to go and help another student or talk to another teacher. Mr. Stevenson would also talk with and be interested in his work, as it would always seem to be that little bit more complex or bigger than the rest of the class. During William's spare time, he would often enter design and engineering competitions he found in his favourite magazines and websites, which often involved designing bridges, cars, and problem-solving. He had won a lot of the competitions and had the paper certificates on his bedroom walls to prove it, but that did not count at school. He even had to lie about his age to enter some of the competitions, as they were for adults only. And he still won. But none of this made him feel less of a school failure and a boy with no future. However, little did he know that he was about to be talked about by some very interested and important people called Tomons, who lived in a world invisible to William and the rest of the people in his visible world. Tomons saw the abilities of William's unique brain as being very useful and important. Order, order for the 672nd meeting of the Igmon-seeking Selection and Integration Council, called an elderly gentleman in silver-rimmed square glasses who sat in a very high-backed, ornate-looking chair. He clapped a metal-looking object between his hands 3 times, creating a powerful bang, bang, bang. The sound echoed around the space and brought the 100 or so Toman councillors, Igman scouts and integration engineering tacticians to silence under the broad-leaded glass-domed ceiling, which held back the slashing and pounding dark weather outside. The space was lit with hundreds of tennis ball-sized, perfectly spherical glass spheres that lazily bobbed up and down in midair like stars above the attendants' heads, running in direct contrast to the violent firestorm raging inside them that shot light in all directions. The old gentleman, who was called a first-rate counsellor, sat on top of a raised-up wooden plinth in the centre of the space, directly under the glass dome. 3 other second-rate counsellors sat around him on a lower platform and looked just as used to and as comfortable with their power as the first-rater. They all wore similar uniforms, consisting of a dark purple bowler hat with a badge of 2 golden interlocking circles on their fronts, and a heavy black jacket covered in intertwined golden prime shapes in straight lines like chains. Which scouts wish to put forward an Igman subject to be considered for Thomon integration to the council? Announced the elderly man over the quiet hall in a voice that was much stronger than his face allowed for. Several Igmon scouts stepped forward to stand on a wooden ring that ran around the first and second raters' platforms and bowed. Glad to see so many of you have a hopeful Igmon subject to present to the council, the first rater said, looking down around him with a practiced smile at the hopeful scouts. But before you begin, might I remind you that this council has been very unimpressed with the subjects put forward for the last few years, many of whom had to be disposed of within the first year. It is your job, might I remind you, as Igmon scouts, to find the gifted children that Igmons so ignorantly overlook. They are to be a benefit to us, and should deserve a place in the Thomon world to help drive us forward into the future. So, if you feel your subject is going to improve the direction of the last few years, then please present your Igmon subject. But if not, then please sit back down and don't waste our time, said the first rater, finishing his little impassioned speech with clear frustration. A flash of sharp lightning outside the dome brightly lit the space for a few seconds, allowing the columns, which leant heavily over, as if frozen mid-fall, that supported the glass dome, to cast long shadows that jumped and turned sudden angles along the uneven stone floor. The first rater signalled with the point of a soft hand to the female scout to his left to begin. "Thank you, sir," she said, as she pulled a playing card-sized notebook from her pocket, covered in unreadably small black lines and a solid block of black ink. She then proceeded to pull a metal object from her belt, called a hadron tool, and pulled the top right corner of the small pad and stretched it until it was A4 size. The small black lines had turned into readable words, and the block of black ink was now a clear portrait of her subject. "Which academy do you scout for?" the first rater asked, while the female scout was fiddling. "Tradwell, sir," she replied, finally getting her papers in order. "Ah, one of the Doggerland academies, very good. Please continue." "I present the case for subject 0647. She attends Heath Hall School for Girls, has 2 older brothers, and is part of a highly thought-of Igmon family. She is 14, she started. 14! The first rater exclaimed with impatient disbelief, the room falling instantly tense with everyone watching, realizing what was about to happen. "What did I just say? This subject is far too old. She will be too hard to integrate," the first rater said with frustration. "But sir, she tried to say over the top of the first rater's voice, but was not given time. "You know she is too old. There have been numerous lectures and training sessions given to all scouts about this and why it is, and so you should know better than to waste the council's time." Yes, I do know that, and thank you for providing all the excellent training, but she is particularly gifted with numbers. I have not seen this level of ability in a long time. I understand that she is past the normal acceptance age for an Igman child, but not by much, and she tried to rattle off the information as quickly as possible before being cut off again. But you know the requirements the council is looking for, the first rater said forcibly, interrupting her. We have extensive years of experience with trying to integrate children above the age of 11 into the Tomon world with very poor results. Might I remind you of Case 742, when the Tomon world was almost revealed at an Igmon location they call Area 51. He paused to let the feeling in the room grow even heavier. That is something I hope you would like to avoid happening again. And it is the view of the second and first raters of this council to see the successful integration of any Igmon child and the safety of the Tomon world as a priority. Thank you, Miss. Miss, he said angrily as his face grew more and more fiery red every second before pausing again as he could not recall the scout's name and calming down. Rose Rod, the scout said with disappointment, realizing her case was over. Thank you, Miss Rose Rod, but this subject will not be taken any further, he said, taking one last moment to glare in annoyance at the scout before he moved on to an Igman scout to his right. Do you have any subjects suitable for this council's requirements? He said, pointing. Yes, sir, I have a boy of 10 years old who suits the council's requirements, and I am scouting on behalf of Belbury Apprenticeship Academy, he said, happy to know his case would not be dismissed. Excellent. Please carry on, the first rater said, pleased, as he relaxed back into his chair and stacked his soft, weak hands on his lap. Subject number 7318. A William Taylor. He is currently at Lakefield School in Guildford, and as far as I have been able to find out, all his Igmon schools have struggled with him. He began, after going through the same routine as the previous scout of enlarging his notes. All his Igmon schools, the first rater interrupted, repeating the phrase, how many? 5 so far, sir. What struggles do they have with the boy? They say he is a disruption to the rest of his class and seems incapable of learning and keeping up with the others, the scout said confidently. No fighting or violence, though, he quickly added, to ensure the first-rate counsellor did not misunderstand the problem. Okay, good. How did you first find out about this boy? I teach his design and technology class, sir, and from very early on I noticed he was gifted far beyond his classmates. So, I started to place very specific engineering competitions in his favourite magazines and websites I knew he visited. Each competition was designed to show and test different areas of his gifting. He entered all of them and won pretty much every one, even ones that I would normally only give to adults. Very good, and good thinking on your part. And what have you learnt? The first rater asked, clearly interested. He has some strong gifting towards engineering and invention, along with being an impressive visual acquirer of knowledge, with a strong visual perception and remarkable level of spatial awareness. He is a good physical athlete, very quick on his feet, and as his Igmon school calls him, heavily dyslexic. He is an only child of a financially struggling Igmon father and mother who try their best for him, but they are at their wits' end as to what to do with him, the scout explained. Do you find him a problem in the ways you mentioned earlier? No, sir, quite the opposite. He is, in fact, my best student. What's your name, Scout? George Stevenson, sir. Very well, George. 7318 sounds most promising. Good work. A no-hoper in the Igmon education system. Dyslexic, an only child, the right age, physically capable, and a potentially gifted engineer. Yes, he sounds like just what we are looking for, the first rater said happily, while leaning forward and looking down at the 3 second raters for their visual approval, who nodded their purple bowler hat, supporting heads in silent agreement. Excellent. I don't need to hear much more on 7318, and I see that there are no objections from the second raters either. He paused to allow for any last-minute objections from the floor. Good. Send him an intervention and see where we get to. Thank you, sir. Before I go, I've heard along with many other scouts about rumours of a Krevak Ragwort starting to dissuade by the use of violence Igmon subjects we select for intervention. Is this true, and what is being done about it? Asked Mr. Stevenson, bringing the room to a nervously interested quiet. Krevak Ragwort is not a problem for us in this council, despite the rumours, and that is all it is, rumours. The Protection and Security Council are dealing with him and those that are spreading these lies. I do not wish to hear his name mentioned again in this chamber. Is that understood? The first rater snapped, sounding annoyed with the question. Yes, very good, sir, thank you, the scout said, while bowing his head before turning to leave, full of confidence that he would finally succeed with an Igmon subject and be the one who found a truly special and gifted subject from the Igmon world. William, being totally and utterly oblivious to this glittering review of his skills and talents, was angry, upset, and mentally exhausted. Yet again, he had been in trouble at school and sent home for causing problems in his Year 6 class, which he felt was totally unfair and that the teacher disliked him instead. So, he sat slumped over his desk in his bedroom, surrounded by the certificates he had won and pictures he had drawn of machines and mechanisms that were stuck to his walls. Scattered over his desk were bits of construction sets and partly finished aeroplane models. Feeling frustrated, his eyes began to well up with tears. He just did not understand all the other lessons, and he was being punished for it yet again. William thumped his table with his fist in annoyance. I just don't get it. Why can't I learn like everyone else? I really want to be able to. With a deep sob, he rested his forehead on the table and closed his eyes, wishing to hide from the world that did not want him. It was at this point that William heard a very confident knock downstairs at the front door. Without moving his head, he opened his damp eyes and heard his dad walk from the kitchen, which was under his bedroom, and along the tile-floor hallway to the door, which was looking in desperate need of a fresh coat of blue paint. His dad opened the door with a metallic click and said, "Hello, how can I help you?" William did not recognize the voice that spoke next straight away, but it very quickly introduced itself. "Good evening, Mr. Taylor. I am William's design and technology teacher, Mr. Stevenson. I heard William was sent home from school today by the head teacher for being what she called a disruptive influence to the class." He paused a few seconds to allow Mr. Taylor to make the link. "I realize," he started again, "that this is not quite normal for a teacher to do a house call, but may I come in and have a chat?" Mr. Stevenson had been waiting patiently for days, just for a moment like this. A moment which his training had taught him would make the acceptance of the intervention far more likely. William shot up to his feet, almost knocking over his chair, which he quickly caught and stilled, before delicately lunging over to the door to put his ear to the gap between the bedroom door and frame to listen. What could he be doing at my house? William thought. Things can't have gotten that bad at school, surely. He listened intently. Downstairs, William's dad, slightly taken aback, said, "Yeah, sure, please come in," whilst taking a look at his watch to confirm that it was indeed late and school had finished a long time ago. Once again, the familiar hallway sounds punctuated upstairs as the pair walked through to the kitchen, followed by the squealing of pine farmhouse chairs being pulled out from under the round farmhouse kitchen table. William could not possibly stay in his room for this. He had to hear what was being said about him. He slowly, quietly, and purposefully pushed down the brass handle on his door. He could hear the bolt slide out of the lock in the jamb of the door, and then he pulled it open. Popping his head around the corner, he looked down the stairs to check the coast was clear. Like a cat stalking its prey, he crept ever so slowly and carefully to the steps, about halfway down the stairs where the rungs of the banister ended, and he could sit and listen to what was being said without being seen. In the kitchen, Mr. Stevenson was handed tea in a mug with a chipped rim and the words, "Keep calm, drink tea," written on the side in red. "Thank you, much appreciated," said Mr. Stevenson gratefully. "I was sorry to hear about your son being sent home today. I have no problems with him in my D&T class. In fact, he is by far the best student I have taught in my time at Lakefields, and he even teaches me a few things every now and then. So, maybe you could enlighten me to what the problem is then. Why is he constantly being sent home or sent to sick bay with a headache?" jumped in Mr. Taylor, in bemused frustration that had built up over the years. Mr. Stevenson took a sip of tea before he responded. "I think, Mr. Taylor, William is very misunderstood. See, he is an immensely clever and intelligent boy, and I've noticed he learns things very differently to the others in his class. Have you noticed how he thinks through things by physically doing something? He needs to move and do practical stuff to learn and understand, which for the most part in all the other classes he is not able to do." He paused to take another sip of tea and then continued. "In the workshop, I get to see him in a very different environment to all the other teachers. He is up and about, doing things with his hands. I often see him helping the other kids with their work when they get stuck. I have tried to explain my thoughts to the other teachers, but as much as they would like to help, they are not able to accommodate what he needs." He paused a few seconds and then restated. "Lakefields just can't accommodate it. It's not that they don't want to do more for William, but they're concerned that if they give him the freedom to move around in the classroom, then all the kids would want to as well. Before long, the whole class would be running around, turning the classroom into break time. I can understand their concern." "So, what do you suggest? To be honest, we don't understand what's going on with him. He seems like any other kid in all other ways. Do we need to give him extra lessons with a tutor outside of school hours? But then, who knows how we could afford that?" The Taylor family was not well off. Mrs. Taylor worked long hours as a secretary for a steel company, and Mr. Taylor was a self-employed gardener, but he currently had no work. "Mr. Taylor," Mr. Stevenson said in a calm tone, seeing that William's dad was clearly at the end of his tether, trying to figure what to do. There is another option, which is why I am here. I am here not on behalf of the Lakefield School, but on behalf of another school organization I work for. You will not have heard of it before, as it is kept very quiet, almost secret from most people. Mr. Taylor laughed. You're joking, right? Let me get this right. You're here telling me, he said, stabbing a finger into the table and leaning forward, that there is a secret school which you are part of, and that you're only pretending to be a teacher at William's school? Mr. Stevenson adjusted himself in his chair, making it creak as he controlled his feelings of annoyance at being thought of as only pretending to be a teacher. He gave everything to his teaching at Lakefield School. It was just part of his main job of being an Igman Scout. William could not believe what he had just heard. His favourite teacher was in his house, chatting with his dad about what sounded like a secret school. William leaned in even harder and listened even more intently to try and hear even more. It is a school for particularly talented and gifted children, like William, Mr. Stevenson said calmly again, allowing time for Mr. Taylor to understand that this was not a joke. Sadly, I don't have much more time now, he said, while pulling a vintage gold pocket watch on a chain out of his pocket, flicking open the lid with a well-practiced thumb movement to glance at the time before standing up. There is a lot to explain, but I would like you to read these information packs before we next meet, he said, as he produced some small postage stamp-sized bits of paper from inside his jacket, which Mr. Taylor looked at with confusion. Thank you for the tea, Mr. Stevenson said, holding the cup up for Mr. Taylor to take. No problem, Mr. Taylor replied, turning and taking the cup to the sink to rinse it. This gave Mr. Stevenson just enough time to use his Hadron tool to touch the 3 tiny bits of paper and enlarge them. Here, please read these, insisted Mr. Stevenson, holding out 3 A4-sized packets of information. Mr. Taylor took them a little bit befuddled, as when he last saw the 3 bits of information, they had been the size of postage stamps. Might I ask if you and William would be free this Friday evening, say around 7 p.m? Could we meet at the Royal Arms pub at the end of your road to discuss the information? Mr. Taylor sat back down, slapped the information papers onto the table, and lifted his hands above his head to stretch and let them settle behind his head, like a man who felt he had nothing to lose. Sure, he said, going along with the strange conversation. Well, thank you for coming by. William quickly realized he had to move back to his room quickly before he was spotted out of bed, and like a silent flash, he was off. The 2 men walked to the front door, shook hands and parted company. Mr. Taylor briefly stood in the open doorway and shook his head in disbelief, scratched his chin and turned to stare up the stairs at William's room. Suddenly, Mr. Stevenson's head reappeared around the door. Forgot to say that the ink on those information packs will disappear by Friday, so read them while you can. Would not want the whole world to know about the best school in the world, he said in a very friendly tone before disappearing again. Right. Okay, said a baffled Mr. Taylor almost to himself, while shutting the door. He turned as slowly as the day had been long and walked up the stairs with tired legs toward William's room. William, who had jumped into bed, pretending to be asleep, ignored the first knock on his bedroom door. When it came again, he answered, "Come in," in his best sleepy voice. His dad stepped into his room, turned the light on, and headed over to William's bed. Sitting next to William, he exhaled a single long and hard breath and said, "Well, that was an interesting conversation I just had with your DT teacher." He paused to unsuccessfully look around his brain for the teacher's name. "What's his name again?" "Mr. Stevenson," William answered, sitting up in bed. "Ah, yes, that was it. According to him, you are a very special and gifted boy who would benefit from what sounds like moving schools." "Again?" "Well," he paused to rub William's hair. "We are going to meet him this Friday at 7 p.m. to find out more. Anyway, get some sleep, as you still have 2 days left of school. In the meantime, I will chat with your mother about this and go over the information he gave us to look at." The 2 days went slowly for William, as he could not wait for Friday evening. He had so many questions. How was this new school going to be any different to all the others? What did Mr. Stevenson mean that he was special? Never had he changed schools because of a positive reason, so this was very new to him. A very normal English, wet and grey Friday came around, and William and his dad headed to the pub, without Mrs. Taylor, who was working overtime. The Royal Arms was a vintage pub. As they approached, warm light from the open fire inside glowed through the small, thick, bottle-green glass windows, and laughter could be heard inside. William's dad pushed the heavy wooden door open with the familiarity of a regular, nodding to the barman, and was greeted with recognition. Quickly, Mr. Taylor scanned the room and spotted Mr. Stevenson sitting at a round table in a quiet corner with 2 wooden armchairs available. William was sticking very close to his dad, as he knew this place fairly well, but not for good reasons, as the Royal Arms pub was not known to be kid-friendly, especially when the football was on. "Good evening, William," Mr. Stevenson said warmly, as he stood up to shake Mr. Taylor's hand. "Please sit," he said, pointing to the empty chairs. "I have got you drinks already. I hope that is okay?" Mr. Taylor looked stunned by the gesture, but managed to say, "Thank you." Mr. Stevenson took a sip from his pint and started to talk. "Well, thank you for coming. Now I want to talk with both of you. That means, William, you are also involved." He saw William nod in understanding and so carried on. "As I said before, I work for an organisation which is little known in mainstream education, and we like to keep it that way. This is why the writing on the information packs will have disappeared by now." This was confirmed by Mr. Taylor, nodding his head and placing the blank A4 packs on the table. "Now you must understand," Mr. Stevenson said, emphasizing the point with his hands. "I cannot tell you everything you will want to know, but only what you need to know to make a decision. Belbury Apprenticeship Academy has been around for a very, very long time, and often selects students from schools around the world to come and join who show particular giftings or talents." William downed half of his glass, hoping to hide the nervous excitement he was feeling. That was making his hands sweat, and placed it back on the coaster. "Your son," Mr. Stevenson continued, "caught my eye a while ago, and we feel he would benefit from joining us." Mr. Taylor stopped Mr. Stevenson. "Right, okay, wait a minute. So, William and I would like to know what you see in him that is so special?" "Well, Mr. Taylor, over the time we have been watching him, we have seen that he sees the world differently to those around him, and interacts with the world differently than others. In the current school he finds himself in, he would be called heavily dyslexic, and it is seen as a problem because he does not fit into the standard classroom environment. He paused to give William and Mr. Taylor a minute to process. "In very simple terms, we're your brain," he said, pointing at Mr. Taylor. "And my brain make connections between point A and point B. Williams go from point A to point E, and sometimes point A doesn't connect to anything at all. This makes him very good at things like visual acquisition and 3D perception. At Belbury Apprenticeship Academy, he is exactly the type of boy we want to work with and teach." William was somewhat taken aback at what his teacher had just said, but a smile grew on his face as he thought about being in a school where he was wanted. He reached for his glass to take another drink, to find to his confusion it was full again. William was perplexed and looked around the pub for who had refilled his drink, but concluded that no one had brought a fresh drink from the bar. No one else had been near the table since they had sat down. He looked at the 2 other pints of beer on the table, and both were as full as if they had never been drunk. But William knew that both men had quickly drunk at least half a pint each. Mr. Stevenson saw William looking at the drinks glasses with wide open eyes and knew he had noticed the drinks were full again. He caught William's eye and gave him a wink while never breaking conversation with Mr. Taylor. William focused back into the conversation, feeling that there might be a connection, just as Mr. Stevenson began saying, "There is, however, one catch if William is to become part of Belbury Academy." "Right," exclaimed Mr. Taylor. "I knew there would be a catch. What is it then? Pay all my money into a random account? Well, I don't think so." Mr. Stevenson quickly butted in. No, it is not like that. The catch is very simple. We keep the academy very quiet, and so anyone who decides to accept an offer and become a pupil must board full-time and will only come home twice a year at Christmas and the summer holidays," Mr. Stevenson said quickly, and visibly saw Mr. Taylor calm down. "Only twice a year," Mr. Taylor replied with some concern. "That's a long time for him to be away, but then again it could be good for him," he carried on, while turning to look at William, thinking about how much he would miss him. "Yes, I totally understand that it is a long time that William will be away for, and it is a common sticking point for parents, but it helps with the new way of learning William will experience," Mr. Steffson explained. "A new way of learning," Mr. Taylor repeated, remembering back to what he had read in the information packs. "Yes, those packs you gave me did make the school, the Apprenticeship Academy classrooms sound very different." "Different," William thought. "Different how? Could a classroom really be any different?" he wondered, as he had not seen the information packs. "Yes, that's right. And the difference is partly why Belbury is called an apprenticeship academy and not a school. In fact, there aren't actually any classrooms at all, which is one reason why it is often so good for kids like William. Instead, all the lessons take place in the business and facilities around Belbury town, which Belbury Academy is part of. Apart from the academy houses and main hall, you would not know there was an academy in Belbury town at all," Mr. Stevenson explained. "No classrooms. Amazing. I hate classrooms," William thought. Mr. Taylor sat back, making the wooden chair creak, and thought for a minute. "Well, William, you have not been able to fit into any other schools so far, so what do you think?" William looked at the full drink in front of him and knew that if he said yes, then he would get to learn about and see more strange and more amazing things than a glass refilling itself. William looked up into his dad's face, his eyes bright with excitement. No classroom sounds really good. I would really like to try." Mr. Taylor could see William was excited at the prospect of fitting in at school, being special, and going off on an adventure. He knew that all the switching of schools had taken its toll on William just as much as it had on him and William's mum. He turned to Mr. Stevenson and tentatively said, "Well, William is in, and I think, by the sounds of what you have said, it's his only hope. However, I will need to finally convince his mother, especially because it's boarding. I will see her when we get home." "Fantastic!" Mr. Stevenson exclaimed, clasping his hands together with happiness, making drinkers on the next table put their frothing pints down and turn in their chairs to look at this very unpub-like emotional outburst. "When you've spoken to Mrs. Taylor, and hopefully she has decided to accept, all you need to do is be at the postbox at the end of Downhole Road at 1834 this coming Thursday." William thought both the time and day were very strange, but that made him all the more keen to be there on time, once his parents had agreed to let him go, of course. They had to let him go, surely, he thought. Mr. Stevenson stood up to leave, saying his goodbyes. Walking past William, he bent down to say, "If I were you, I would keep your coaster, as it probably has a few drinks left in it." With that, he left, calling behind him, "See you at school." Both Mr. Taylor and William paused and sat in silence briefly before turning back to the table, where William snatched up the remaining coasters into his pockets. The next few days passed as fast as a rock is eroded by the wind for William. Several times he could hear his parents heatedly talking about the decision in the kitchen below his room. For him, the decision was easy. He had even planned to do a runner if his parents said no. His bag lay open on his bedroom floor, ready to be packed. It was now 18:05 on Thursday, and William's parents had still not made a decision. Nervously, he waited at his desk, sketching an idea for a time machine in one of his many books to stay calm. Finally, his mother's voice called from the kitchen, "Come down here, William." William threw down his pen and ran down the stairs so fast his feet barely touched any of the steps, and then down the corridor into the kitchen. His mum and dad were both sitting around the table, and both looked tired as a result of all the back and forth talking. "Well," William's mum said, she was a very thin, short lady and had a sharp voice, "we have decided that under one condition you may go." William could barely believe it. "Yes," he said, "anything." "I know it does not sound like much, but you must contact us after 2 weeks to let us know how you are getting on. Your dad and I understand that this is a chance that you may never get again, and so we want you to try." William lunged towards his mum and dad, hugged them, then rushed back off up the stairs to pack his bag, almost faster than he came down them. His mum also came upstairs and gathered clothes and a wash bag for him, and placed them in the already open green canvas bag. William's idea of packing was very different. In went his sketch pads and pencil case, his books about big mining machinery and ancient weapons, and of course, some Lego. He forgot all about how to stay clean and what to wear. He was going on an adventure. "If you're going to make it, we need to leave now," his dad called from downstairs. Before William knew it, he was doing something between a walk and a run down the road, trying to keep up with his parents, and reach the red postbox with 3 minutes to spare. The Taylor family had a few quiet moments as they stood on the curb, waiting in the cold dark. "How are you feeling, boy?" William's mum said, while placing a hand on his shoulder. William looked up at his mother, recognizing a gentleness in her that was normally missing. "I'm really nervous, Mum, but very excited. My tummy is full of butterflies, feels like they are trying to take off." Down the road came a very standard white minibus with the word coach on its side. It pulled up next to the post box at exactly 1834. Mr. Taylor chuckled quietly to himself, saying, "I thought coaches were meant to be bigger." The minibus's side door slid open to reveal Mr. Stevenson standing on the first step, beaming at William. "Excellent, I knew you would accept," came his happy greeting. William turned to his mum and dad. "Well, it begins, I guess. Bye then." Giving them both a hug, he stepped into the minibus and poked his head back out of the door for a last chance to wave goodbye. Mr. Stevenson shook both Mr. and Mrs. Taylor's hands and said that he would take good care of William, then stepped up into the minibus and slid the door shut. Excitedly, William turned to look down the minibus for a place to sit and froze. From the outside, this had been a very normal white minibus, despite wearing a rather optimistic name on its side. Inside, however, it was anything but. It seemed to extend forever. Winding its way, back and back and back, with kids and adults scattered on the seats down some of its length, with an equal amount of luggage above their heads on racks. There was also an area that looked like a romantic French bar where people could get food and drinks. Further down, William could see rows of stacked hammocks, some containing gently swinging, sleeping people. Mr. Stevenson gave William a gentle push on his upper back, saying, "Let's go find you a seat." William looked up and said, "But sir, the bus, look, what's happening?" "Ha! Yes. Well, this is what happens when you experiment with infinite mechanics after a game of fours," Mr. Stevenson replied with a laugh. "I have yet to find the back, but it does come in handy when there is lots of kit to carry. Ah, perfect. Here we go. Take a seat here, William, and we will be on our way." Mr. Stevenson walked back to the front, talked to the driver, and William felt the infinitely long minibus pull away, leaving his mum and dad waving innocently from the pavement, none the wiser about the TARDIS-like inside of the minibus that was right in front of them. William, braving a look backwards, saw the infinitely long minibus snaking and curving all the way down, like a train, without an end as it drove.